do it. As usual.
So we've got 1, 2, 3, 6. Okay.
So this is the mic for the training session.
Yeah. Can I get more chairs here?
More chairs.
Yeah. Is it possible?
Okay, I think we should get some of the questions.
Yeah. I need
But already
one.
the panel is
So I have 5 panelists, myself, and 2 opening statements. So it's 8.
5,
But
you, and total 8.
2 opening statements, 5 panelists, 2 sort of opening.
Yeah.
But I can maybe just put it.
Yeah, no, I
I
wasn't.
think we can put the more chairs beside here.
Okay.
And I don't know. It feels like long ago. I was still a student.
How are you doing?
There's no need to make an introduction.
No, you know each other. That's good. I'm
But it's true that I have to say, I thought you were here as well.
This is the mic for the training session.
Hi. Teaching. Very nice to meet you. Great. I'm just gonna sort this out and then we're good. So that's the mic for the kid.
So do you know this box?
What's that?
This box.
Yeah.
So you throw it,
Draw it. Okay.
and catch it, and then stick.
Great. So I will say that she's coming later.
How are you doing?
Because the next is the event starts
I mean, it's like.
in 15 minutes break.
Yeah.
So you should finish your session on time.
Yeah.
Not more than 5 minutes.
And how about you?
And please take any leftover materials with you after this.
Mary is fine. She or I think are on the road. Oh, let's sit over there. We can.
Are you gonna go to the Yes. Yeah.
Time.
But just for 30 minutes. And I was wondering if you need that.
Keep going.
So I was wondering if I need to report.
So I can still do for a couple of minutes. Okay, so as I was explaining, I used to have Parallel. I'm so tired. And now
Sorry.
Yeah.
Great potential.
I have now.
Yes.
Sure. I can do it.
How are you? Put it on the
No, the ambassador comes with people.
Yeah.
Well, the executive secretary, Adriana, will say a few words just about the pledge.
Yeah.
And then because ambassador comes later.
All right. So I'll move to here.
Yeah, there's table.
Yeah.
And that is.
Sorry, I'm just running out of another thing. So
No, no problem.
I'm a bit.
What's
I just hope that
Titi, I can ask you to come and join us on.
I'm running the broadcasting program from please don't close it.
Okay.
Alan Miller from the National Human Rights.
Yeah, Stefan looked it so out. I hope that's this to
One chance.
have to see.
Alan Miller from the National Human Rights.
Pero bueno, ¿nos podemos? Ya, no. Es que esto es
Something good from Geneva. I hope the thing works out.
Yeah, it's always a risk.
Morning meeting. For a very quick presentation. I don't remember the actual
labor.
Yeah, but there was a very quick in the morning.
Okay.
Sorry. We're providing coverage of this site through IFC and
All right.
appreciation building. So great to get a business card. I just wanted to make sure get everything correctly spelled and filled
Okay, vamos a see. Can we kind of move a bit this way, Stefan? Sorry.
Sure. I mean, I'm in between.
Yeah, in
legs,
between
so that's
legs.
fine.
At the end there, Max.
Are you participating?
If you can sit next to Stefan, that would be fantastic.
Hola. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this event. I am very glad to see a quite full room and to welcome you here on behalf of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. My name is Ben Schachter. I'm the office focal point on climate change and the environment at the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I'm extremely pleased to be here and welcome you to this event, which is being organized by the office and by the Geneva Pledge for Human Rights and Climate Action. So in particular, I want to thank the Geneva Pledge for co-sponsoring the event and for the fruitful collaboration we've enjoyed since the pledge was first launched by Costa Rica together with 17 other countries and Geneva in February 2015. I would also like to thank each state who has since taken this voluntary pledge to facilitate the exchange of expertise and best practices between its human rights and climate experts in order to build collective capacity to deliver responses to climate change that are good for people and planet. The pledge now has over 30 signatories representing a cross-regional grouping of states, and we welcome its ongoing contributions to the important discussion of human rights and climate change. OHCHR is proud to have been involved with the pledge since its inception, and particularly for the work we've done together to advance the discussion on the intersections between human rights and climate change at the Human Rights Council and at the Unfccc, which is a shared priority for both of us. The benefits of these efforts are evidenced by the increased interest in and growing number of events addressing climate change at the Council, and more importantly, by the engagement of the Council's human rights monitoring and reporting mechanisms with climate-related issues. The importance of these intersections is also apparent here at the Unfccc, and the preamble of the Paris Agreement, the extension and strengthening of the Lima Work Program on Gender, the inclusion of human rights language and capacity building decisions at the 22nd Conference of the Parties in Marrakesh, and the continuing negotiations at the Unfccc today. This session featured for the first time a presidency event on human rights, which was a technical briefing on climate rates, climate change, and the rights of the child that took place this Monday and was organized by Morocco as president of the 22nd Conference of the Parties to the Unfccc. And I'd like to thank Morocco, another member of the Geneva Pledge, for this outstanding initiative. It's also evident in many workshops and side events taking place during this session, and we'll touch upon those more later. But I'd like to move on directly to our very first and honored speaker. We're privileged to be here with her today at a critical time when the need for urgent climate action has never been more clearly recognized, and the possibilities, tools, and demands for ensuring a rights-based approach to climate action that truly benefits all people have never been more widely recognized. And Executive Secretary Patricia Espinosa, on behalf of the Pledge and OHCHR, I want to thank you very much for joining us and making time and your busy schedule to speak at this event. I also want to recognize the frequent collaboration that we've had with you, including an event which was organized by the Geneva Pledge for Human Rights at the 33rd session of the Human Rights Council, in which you came and spoke to the Council along with the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or spoke at a side event to the Council rather. And this collaborative spirit and the linking of the human rights and climate change worlds is precisely what the Pledge is about. And we welcome your comments and remarks. Thank you.
I use this one, or
as you prefer.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, dear friends, I want to greet also all the members of the panel. It is really indeed an honor for me to be able to participate in this event organized by the Geneva Pledge. I do want to thank all of you. I'm very encouraged by such a full room, such a good attendance, which shows how much commitment there is in all regions of the world on this issue. Because our conversation today is really critically important. Climate change is evidently a pressing human rights issue. Climate change impacts such extreme weather events or rising sea levels will affect homes, lives, and livelihoods. As such, climate change directly and indirectly affects a range of specific human rights, such as the right to life, the right to water, to food, to health, or housing. This direct link between climate change and human rights also affects, of course, women, indigenous peoples, and other vulnerable groups. It was the forward-looking countries that initiated the Geneva Pledge that really elevated human rights in the context of climate change. Your vision was exemplary. I am convinced that the Geneva Pledge helped pave the way for a much greater consideration of human rights in the context of climate change. It raised awareness and brought possibilities for a holistic approach to the fore. The Paris Agreement preamble acknowledges that climate change is a common concern of humankind. It states that parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights. The Sustainable Development Goals similarly seek to realize the human rights of all. And the SDGs speak to those rights directly, from the food and water that make up our most essential right to life, to civil and political rights that are part of inclusive societies where women and girls are treated equally and opportunity is open to all. Human rights and the corresponding obligations of nations are not limited to the preamble, the SDGs, or the present generation. However, one of the key opportunities that countries created through the Paris Agreement and the SDGs is the potential for systemic change, a long-term shift at a generational scale, a transformation where the human rights of all are guaranteed. And they offer the opportunity to provide the most vulnerable with the full support they need to cope with the impacts of climate change. These opportunities need to be seized. I'm really happy that today this meeting, this conversation is taking place, that we have such a distinguished panel, and that all these exercise and commitment will feed into the process. The Geneva Pledge can be, and is actually already, a guiding light for these efforts. It is encouraging that representatives from Latin America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and some small island developing states have already signed the pledge. In recognizing the injustice faced by the poorest and most vulnerable people, these countries pledge to enable meaningful collaboration between national representatives of the UNFCCC and the processes of the Human Rights Council. Their vision includes that the pledge helps countries to better design climate action that is good for people and good for the planet. This is critically important as we move into the era of implementation of both the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. The Geneva Pledge provides a policy forum where interested parties can collaborate to strengthen concrete actions at the national level. This is critically important, but I would venture to say that more is needed. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, this is a key moment for climate change, sustainable development, and human rights. We need to make it a momentum that puts the inalienable human rights of every person on this planet at the center of the transformation of social and economic development. And I want to thank you all again, wish you a very fruitful discussion, and look forward to hearing from your deliberations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Patricia Espinosa, for joining us. I understand that the Executive Secretary will not be able to stay with us for the entire session, but we're really grateful to have had you join us for those opening remarks, and welcome you to excuse yourself when you need to, and stay as long as you like. We hope you may have a chance to hear from one or two of our panelists. At this point, I want to announce a small change in the program. Ambassador Khan, representing and the chief negotiator of the 23rd incoming presidency to the UNFCCC, will be joining us a bit later, and she's going to deliver, instead of an opening statement right now, some closing remarks instead. And I'm very grateful to our next speaker, Adriana Murillo from Costa Rica, for agreeing on very last-minute notice to make a brief statement in her place. Costa Rica is the host of the Geneva Pledge and a very important collaborator of and with, not sure if I got that quite right, but a frequent partner of OHCHR in works to advance integrating human rights and climate action. And we're really grateful that Adriana was able to join us on this short notice. So thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank OHCHR for the organization of this event, and to all of you for attending, and of course to the Executive Secretariat for joining us and for the support that you have shown for this issue. Well, as Benjamin has already explained, in 2015, Costa Rica, together with other 17 countries, announced the Geneva Pledge on Human Rights and Climate Action during the 8th part of the second session of the ad hoc working group of the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, as we know it, the 2.8 ADP. From that time, I think we have almost doubled the number of countries that have joined the Geneva Pledge. And as he also explained, this is a voluntary, non-binding initiative that look for exchange knowledge and experiences from the both communities, human rights community and climate change community. During the negotiations that we had for the Paris Agreement, several countries, champion countries, including Mexico and some other friends from the Geneva Pledge, we promote the inclusion of human rights in the text of the Paris Agreement, although the initial proposal was to include it in the, not in the preambular part, but in the operative part. But at the end, we finally achieved an inclusion in the preambular part of the Paris Agreement. Although that was the initial idea, I believe that inclusion in the preamble was a big achievement anyway, because it's the first time in history that the binding instruments states and acknowledge the need to address climate change while respecting, promoting, and considering the respective obligation on human rights. The Geneva Pledge has had several activities in Geneva, but also in the UNFCCC context, we have had, together with other countries of the Geneva Pledge, made some efforts. We had last year a meeting of negotiators of the Geneva Pledge countries. And also last COP, we organized together with Belgium, Chile, Luxembourg, and with the co-sponsorship of other members of the Geneva Pledge, a side event. But we believe that now we have a bigger challenge, and is to identify the procedural ways and entry points to advance this agenda of human rights and gender equality within the UNFCCC. On the national perspective, I will just very briefly share our view in Costa Rica. Since 1994, with the reform of the Constitution, with amendment of the Constitution, we incorporate the right to a healthy and ecological balanced environment in the Constitution. Therefore, for us, it's very natural to see how really human rights issues are very linked to climate change. And for the preparation of our NDC, we had a serial of workshops with the different sectors. And at the end, we, in our NDC, include a reference to human rights and gender equality. Now we are, let's say, in the next phase, that is the implementation phase. Although our political will is clear, I think all the countries face the challenge on how to really apply this in practice. The first step that we are taking to really incorporate human rights in climate policies is with our national adaptation plan that we are preparing, and we hope to have it ready for 2019. And we are working to have in this plan to incorporate a gender and human rights perspective. I just wanted to share with you this brief experience, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Adriana, for that insight from Costa Rica about the pledge. I'd like to move on now to our set of panelists, and really grateful for those opening remarks. And our first panelist is Mr. Stefan Röckti, from the Head of Environment and Sustainable Development at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs in Switzerland. And he's joining us now for this discussion, and has on many previous occasions in Geneva, where OHCHR's main office is. And we are also grateful for the wonderful history of collaboration with Switzerland on this issue, and welcome your remarks, Mr. Röckti, on the way forward and on the pledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you very much for the invitation to this event. And Röckti is a bit hard as a name, so Stefan is easier. So speaking for Switzerland, I would first like to thank the COP22 presidency in Morocco for their efforts to organize a presidency event this past Monday, specifically a technical briefing focusing on climate change and the rights of the child. Coming justly at the beginning of our two-week conference, this event reminded us of the intricate relationship between climate change and human rights, and the major impacts climate change has on the enjoyment of human rights, in particular the rights of our children. We equally appreciated the dedication emphasized by the incoming COP23 presidency Fiji at this presidency event. And we look forward to their guidance on matters of human rights and climate change over the next 2 years. And last but not least, we also greatly value the engagement of the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC in this regard. Many may remember that in preparation for COP21 in Paris, parties met in Geneva in February 2015. Geneva is the home of the UN Human Rights Council and the home of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and it may rightfully be considered the international human rights capital. We owe it to Costa Rica that they seized the occasion of having the climate negotiators in Geneva and to form the Geneva Pledge, which has since united 33 committed parties in their efforts to secure the reflection of human rights concerns in climate actions. We are convinced that the Geneva Pledge played a significant role in raising the awareness for the relevance and the necessity to reflect human rights in the Paris Agreement. While we are still in the midst of discussing the future implementation of the Paris Agreement, where indeed there will be opportunities to see human rights concerns taken up both at the conceptual level and most importantly on the ground, the human rights community in Geneva has continued to engage vigorously on the matter. Of particular interest to us is the recent and continued engagement of the Human Rights Council and of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Upon the initiative of a cross-regional group consisting of, again, Costa Rica, Slovenia, the Maldives, Morocco, and Switzerland, the Human Rights Council has tabled and passed resolutions on human rights and the environment. The Human Rights Council has appointed a special rapporteur on human rights and the environment. John Knox, the special rapporteur, has published excellent reports and is also doing a great job of outreach to different institutions and stakeholders, including UNEP and UNFCCC. Another regular resolution of the Human Rights Council, facilitated by the Philippines, Bangladesh, and Vietnam, addresses climate change specifically. Equally, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has been very active in this field and also stands out as co-organizer of today's event. The Geneva Pledge seeks to strengthen the cooperation between the experts on human rights and on climate change. At first sight, we may so far have failed in this effort, as the exchange among negotiators and practitioners in the two fields is not obvious. It appears as if the two groups remain in their own silos. Although environmental factors are now widely accepted among the human rights community in Geneva, human rights negotiators only seldom travel to participate in climate change negotiations, and the same is true for the reverse. The most visible vectors of exchange are the representatives of civil society and of the UN bodies, and they're also present today, and I would like to thank you very much for your engagement. Their role and their engagement is indeed most laudable. They're crucial in bridging gaps that remain between the two realms. Still, and on second sight, there may be more ongoing than meets the eye, and I can only deduce this from the cooperation within my own country. But have we, as Switzerland, since been at the forefront in bridging the gap? The Swiss INDC, indeed the first among all INDCs, was put forward very early in 2015 and elaborated before the Geneva Pledge came into existence. We did expand on equity considerations in the INDC, which are conceptually not that far from human rights consideration, but the specific mention of human rights was not yet picked up. There may, of course, be an opportunity to address human rights in the next NDC, but although that is still a few years away. The Geneva Pledge may weigh if some guidance, or consider if some guidance for the next generation of NDCs could bring us forward. There's no immediate urgency, and we have a moment to look into it, but it's certainly an effort to consider among the dedicated countries of the Geneva Pledge. The national communications may be another instrument the Geneva Pledge may look into regarding guidance. To end, the Geneva Pledge is an important association of engaged countries that keeps its great potential, and that potential exists both at the national level, with the promotion of interactions among climate and human rights practitioners and negotiators, and also at the international level, where countries can mutually foster each other's engagement, including here at the climate negotiations. But we must be frank and acknowledge that this potential of the Geneva Pledge has not yet been fully exploited. With the help of all of you, the 33 dedicated member countries shall be in position to do more in the future. When it comes to Switzerland, Our engagement in international cooperation and the Nansen Initiative with its focus on disaster-induced cross-border displacement, and our human rights engagement in bilateral and multilateral fora are all proof that we are committed to human rights, including in relation to climate change actions on the ground. It comes then naturally that we look forward to continuing being an active member of the Geneva Pledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for those remarks on behalf of Switzerland. And to everybody in the room, I'd like to acknowledge that Ambassador Kohn has just joined us and welcome her here for this conversation. And we look forward to hearing from Ambassador Kohn her concluding remarks at the end of this event. And I will now carry on with the proceedings. And our next speaker is Alan Miller, the Special Envoy of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. We've also worked together in the past, and in particular at an event which was organized by the 22nd the presidency of the 22nd Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC on national human rights institutions at the margins of COP22 and their role in addressing climate change. So, Alan, we hope to hear from you a bit about that event. And I also just want to announce that I'm going to circulate a sign-up sheet, and I hope that doesn't distract from the event at all, but we do appreciate collecting the information. So that will be coming around. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, and through you to OHCHR and to the Geneva Pledge states for inviting the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions to join the panel. Isn't it good in these times that a human rights meeting is so packed out that there's almost standing room only, including for Ambassador Khan? I mean, that shows you that something is happening. So welcome to you, and I'm glad you found a seat, Ambassador. I think it's the last one in the room. I would like, in the time I have, just to share with you what national human rights institutions are doing around the world in this area, and what we aim to do further with your support and with your cooperation. Not all of you may know what is a national human rights institution, so I'll take just 10 seconds. They are independent bodies established by law in over 100 countries around the world with a mandate to promote and protect human rights. They serve as a bridge within their own countries between civil society and the state, and between state and the international human rights system. NHRIs, because of that mandate, fully recognize the share of responsibilities that they have towards the achievement of the Paris Agreement and the SDGs and the realization of human rights for everyone, everywhere. Our role is quite clearly understood by us all, and we've begun to take action on the ground around the world. Literally within days of the SDGs being agreed in 2015, we brought together all of the global NHRIs to determine what do we do in this context, what's our responsibility, and how do we practically operationalize that. And then in terms of the Paris Agreement, as Ben was referring to in Marrakesh last year, we again brought together NHRIs to determine what is the relationship between us, the Paris Agreement, and our work in SDGs. So we're in gear. It's only beginning, but we certainly know that the road ahead is one we want to travel along with yourselves. Our approach generally is that of constructive challenge towards member states in the obligations that they have entered into. And I'll just give you some very brief examples across the 4 regions that GANRI is organized in: Asia Pacific, Africa, the Americas, and Europe. If we take Asia Pacific, one of our members there, the Philippines National Human Rights Institution, is currently carrying out some groundbreaking work. It received a petition from a wide variety of civil society organizations, including indigenous peoples and trade unions, to carry out an investigation as to the claimed responsibility of business, of multinational companies, the carbon majors as they have been called, in terms of their breach of human rights through their contribution to climate change. The Global Alliance tomorrow is publishing an amicus brief in this case to support the NHRI, giving itself this mandate to carry out the inquiry, and from that then to make recommendations as to what steps should be taken and what are the responsibilities of the private sector in terms of their impact on climate change. In South Africa, the South African Human Rights Commission is working very closely with the South African National Statistics Office to ensure that there is human rights-based data that is collected as part of the contribution towards measuring progress with the SDGs. And with the OHCHR, GANRI is exploring a protocol between GANRI and all of the national statistics offices around the world to ensure that we are equipped with the sufficient data of the reality on the ground in order to measure and to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs. In the Americas, we have the Argentinian NHRI, which is doing a very interesting piece of work, and not the only one, but it's certainly playing a leading role in looking across all the international human rights treaties that states have ratified and just cross-referring the commonality between those human rights obligations and the commitments that have been made through the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, so that national human rights institutions, when they carry out their monitoring and reporting on the implementation of international human rights treaties, be it to the Universal Periodic Review, treaty bodies, the Human Rights Council, we are able to cross-refer to these existing human rights obligations and the commitments entered into by states in terms of the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. In Europe, we have much activity taking place. Perhaps one of the most interesting, and I'm not saying this just because I'm Scottish, but I think it's objective. The Scottish Human Rights Commission was influential in ensuring that the Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government formally adopted climate justice as its approach towards climate change, and is now currently working with the Scottish Government to integrate the SDG targets and indicators into the country's national performance framework to make sure they're embedded in how the country sets its direction and measures its progress in a way that is completely aligned with realizing the SDG and its obligations under the Paris Agreement and taking a climate justice approach towards doing that. Across all of the NHRIs around the world, we are beginning over the next few months to carry out some serious capacity building to improve the ability of NHRIs to step up and meet this share of the responsibilities that they have and that some have already begun to take up. So that's what's happening on the ground, or just a snapshot of what is taking place on the ground. But where GANRI now is beginning to go is not simply being a network that coordinates various activities, but we want to achieve greater advocacy, greater influence in the regional and international policy-making and decision-making fora. So to bring this kind of experience on the ground and our human rights-based approach into these discussions and into these decision-making fora. Example would be that next week I'm going to New York to begin to explore how the General Assembly resolution from 2015, which called upon processes such as the high-level political forum on the SDGs to open its doors to independent participation of NHRIs, how we can operationalize that, how we can bring this experience from around the world into these processes with some effect. And we need support of member states in order to get through that door. So I'm very pleased to have been invited and to take part in this discussion. I look forward to the interaction we'll have and look forward to the cooperation that is so necessary to bring about the transformation that we're all here to do. So thanks very much, Ben.
Thank you very much, Alan. And I think we've heard already some very interesting ideas about steps the Geneva Pledge for Human Rights and Climate Action can take to further its objectives, and also about things happening at the national level in national human rights institutions in this area. And our next speaker is going to continue along lines of concrete areas where human rights can really make a difference. And I'd like to introduce Hindu Ibrahim and invite her to come and switch places with me. I think we're working with, okay, well, then I'd like to thank the Executive Secretary very much for joining us. And we will have Hindu in a moment.
So just to say, I'm not replacing Patricia, but you know, I supposed to be in the panel, but there was not enough seat. And indigenous peoples are sitting kicked out. Then hopefully that you cannot kick us and our ideas out from the negotiation. So you can take it in the middle of you. I will love to sit next to you, but there was no issue. So that's just what I wanted you to hear. Okay. Thank you. So finally, I'm in the panel. So thanks you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for organizing this event. So I'm the co-chair of the International Indigenous People Forum on Climate Change. And now for us, when we say indigenous peoples, it's already talking about the rights and rights of the peoples and rights of the environment, both of them. So firstly, we are very great that the Paris Agreement have already the human right, including the indigenous people's rights. So the next step that we had, it was in Marrakesh, where we discussed the proper way of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And that was the decision 135 of the Paris Agreement into the platform of knowledge exchange of indigenous peoples and the local communities. Then in this one, we make it very participatory as indigenous peoples, how we can take part in these UNFCCC negotiations and make our voices, because we said you cannot talk about our knowledge without talking about our rights. Because if we protect the rights of the peoples, we protect them knowledge. And we say you cannot negotiate these issues without us, because the knowledge holders, it's indigenous peoples. Then of course, we are coming from the state, depending from the state, who have plenty right of negotiations, but they do not know about our rights. That's why our voice is very important in these negotiations. Then it's happened with the Moroccan presidency that we are so grateful. It's a challenge, I know. So then we get with a great outcome who was, I think, the only one decision adopted 100% in Paris, in Marrakesh, sorry. So as indigenous peoples, what is important for us is how this platform of knowledge can be implemented, can be established and implemented. Then in this establishment, we have our own proposition and how we make that. So for us, it's clear the purpose. It has to be based into the right-based approach, and that is the human rights declaration that we have. The UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples should be the best. And secondly, we have the ILO Convention 169, who could be also the international instrument under the human rights, who can be the best of this platform. So through this purpose, we can see how the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples through the FPIC, because we have this modality. Information and consultations are two different things. And we have this one adopted by many international organizations. When you go through the prior informed consent, and that can be very sustainable. And that's what all of us are going through, the sustainable development that we want. So then sustainability is very important. Then how we design this one, we say after this purpose, we have to establish the structure, because we need a proper structure, and we know that under the UNFCCC, there is no proper mechanism where all the observer can take part on certain kind of issues. And for this one, into the platform, if we didn't define the clear mechanism, it cannot be effective for the implementation. And implementation for us, not meaning only international level, but regional, national, ground, where the people are impacted, but where they have value to add, and they can change the things, and they can change it quickly. So we propose to have presentation under the group, we can call it, I know the many technical names in UNFCCC, advisory or groups or something, but 7 regions of indigenous peoples need to be represented. And then the state to give us voices. And then one of the body who is the SAPSTA who is hosting us. And through this structure, we asked to have like a continuous technical meeting and expert meetings where indigenous peoples can prove to all of you by thematic areas. For example, we can take water. We say, okay, we can share the indigenous people's knowledge on water, and that can be used by every region around the world to make the sustainability into the water management, because we do have those knowledges. So we wanted to make it very concrete in each COP and each intersessional negotiations. And then we asked to have also a division on indigenous peoples, because we cannot continuously making the contact and we do not have a person or division who can represent indigenous people under the UNFCCC, where we can communicate directly and have all the issues, because the negotiation is just the two things during intersessional and COP. But between them, this big gap, this is the place where we can implement underground, and that we create, we design this mechanism to help us to join this implementation clearly. And then the function. We cannot make a functionality of all this without a clear design support and mechanism. And that's why we are here in Bonn, and we know that in parallel the negotiation into the budget is going on. But how the negotiation into the budget can create a clear mechanism to take into the considerations the peoples who are contributing there as experts. Because we know under the UNFCCC, it's only, they only have right to pay for the state party who are coming as focal point, but zero mechanism to pay for the observer. Just if maybe they are a resource person, as they are calling the name, but no, the resource person is just for 1 day or 2 days. But we want to have the sustainability and the collaboration. So this mechanism need to be created under the budgeting areas to allow the secretariat to do the work, and to allow us to come there and have this concrete work. So I will end by the 2 days that we are having here: 16, 10 to 1, 17, 3 to 18. So this dialogue will allow it all of us to understand each other. What's the meaning of the platform? And what are we expecting? So for us, we expect to have state parties who will be with us, discuss with us, because they are the one who will design the policy back home to link up the indigenous people's knowledge through the adaptations program and adaptation documents. All the NAPs, NAPAs, and all the rest and others need to be include this indigenous people's knowledge. And we are talking about the NDCs. And the NDCs for 2018, if they didn't include the indigenous people's knowledge and rights from now on, what are they going to present in 2018? So it will be always a gap. So to avoid this gap, these 2 days can allow us to see how we can design a better platform to take all those needs into the consideration. So I thank you very much for this floor, and hopefully we will have you and that you will support us, because helping indigenous peoples is helping all over the world. We are keeping 80% of the biodiversity around the world. So we want not help our peoples, but we want assist the planet, and planet meaning all of you and all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Right, I turned it off. That explains that. Thank you very much, Hindu, for your comments and especially the introduction of the discussion that's going to happen next week on the local communities and Indigenous peoples traditional knowledge platform. I think that's a really critical entry point to address issues related to Indigenous people's rights. And of course, there's a much larger discussion to be had about participation of Indigenous peoples at the UNFCCC as a whole. But I'm afraid I don't have enough time to go in depth into that issue because we have two more excellent panelists, and I'd like to remind them to do their best to keep to the time limits. So we have a little bit of time left at the end, and I apologize that it's always the case that the last panelists get this reminder. But that's when my eye starts going to the clock. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Titi Sontero, who's the director of OHCHR for Gender, Social and Ecological Justice. It's my pleasure to have just met Titi, but I hope that we are able to work very much going forward. And I'd like her to address, to the extent that she'd like to, Gender Action Plan, and in particular the workshop that's started yesterday and which carries on this afternoon at 3. And I had the privilege of being there yesterday and for a very important discussion on this subject. Thank you, Titi.
So thank you, Ben, for the introductions and also for the invitations to this session and talking about the gender perspective and the women's rights into the whole negotiations here. So before I go into the workshop of the Gender Action Plan, I would like to share you about our work, which is we are doing a documentations of women's experience with climate projects in Indonesia. We learn from their good best practices and bad practices. The 9 projects cover mitigation, adaptations, water project, RED Plus project, agriculture projects, and any other projects. Amazingly, it was more difficult to find best practices projects rather than the bad practice projects. So I was wondering why it's so happened. So this is actually to have a lesson learned from the women's experience, what they think a good climate project should be, look like for them. And how the project proponent can avoid certain things that will affect the life of the women on the grounds, because they are the one at the end who will receive, who will experience any actions that are provided or that are run by people coming to their area doing good things for them according to their thought. So projects that empower the women according to these grassroots women in Indonesia was the projects that opened for discussions with women since the beginning, during the design of the projects, during collection of information, and they also receive information about what will be the impact and what should be avoided during the implementations of the projects. And if there is challenges, then they will discuss together. So they feel those kind of projects that really considers their right to participation, their right to informations, and all the rights to water and so on. This is really can empower them. Not only that they can not at the end, during the process, empowered to talk, because usually women in the community, they are not very have a courage to speak in the public, in the community. So they feel they're empowered to articulate, and they can find ideas And they feel also they can talk with other groups in the society. So there's really empowerment because of the knowledge of and the exercise of the rights. But women who experience bad projects, because they are not informed, suddenly there come a team just saying, oh, we want to ask you to plant trees or seedlings for this project, and they don't know how much they will pay, how long the work, and so on. So they feel frustrated because they don't know, but the expectation was different. So frustrated, not empowered, and then angry, you know. And then it's increased social tension. Of course, nobody in this room or in this meeting expect that a goodwill project will end at the social tensions within the community. Because therefore, we need to really pay attention to consider the rights of the communities, men and women, that they have the right to get the informations about the action, if it in this context, climate action. They have the rights to be involved, participatory, meaningfully, in the project design, in the project monitoring, in the project's implementation, and so on, and hear what they think. Because climate action can be also a general action, but the action that really effective is actually the actions that come from the people on the ground, come from the women, and really according to their needs. It's a site-specific, it's a problem-specific, and it's solution-specific. So with this base, this experience of this woman, we will release later on our documentation. Then we come to this big meeting. You know, our role is actually just to remind everyone that there is another thing. It's not only about technical issue that we talk, but we also talk about people. We talk about them and what actually they need. So this also, those experiences, we bring also to the discussion of the Gender Action Plan. So it's not only gender consideration, not only to look at the social constructions, but really to how to put the women's rights into all the negotiation, all into the bodies of the UNFCCC. So integration is very important on this. Some examples, for example, some examples. Joint work, in-session workshop. I think this is my first experience after sometimes to have a in-session workshop where all the stakeholders can sit together and then raise the issue. I think it is a good exercise and a good practice that should be also mandatory in the intersectional and COPs if it is related to discussions about the woman. So also integrating, it's only some examples that we can thought. We can, the women and gender constituency make a sort of list of, on what is actually important to the Gender Action Plan. We can provide to you later on. For example, also integrating the gender consideration into the accounting methodologies and reporting. One of the good examples is in the UNFCCC body is actually the Green Climate Funds, because they have gender policy and they have also the Gender Action Plan. Now it's being updated. The important things also for this institution, for example, is the reporting, how the gender policy of the GCF and the Gender Action Plan of the GCF is implemented throughout the project cycle until now. So then it can reflect that how serious actually the UNFCCC bodies in the consideration of gender and including the woman's right in their in the channeling or disbursement of money for the projects on the ground. And I think it's also important that right now the parties are discussing about the rule books, that the rule books also required reporting on the integrations of women's rights, gender consideration into all the reporting. I think that's just some examples and some experience we can discuss in the intersection. Thank you.
Thank you, Titi. And so I think what's interesting is we've heard a lot about participation and the importance of participation. And we've heard some good ideas about how to make various processes at the UNFCCC more participatory. And I think one of the ways to do that is precisely to integrate human rights better in the rulebook for implementation of the Paris Agreement, which is something that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has been advocating on very strongly, but we're certainly not the only ones, and you've heard from other speakers along similar lines. Our final panelist is Mr. Marcus Orellana, who is the director of the Environment and Human Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. Many of you may know him from a variety of previous capacities and being here at the UNFCCC. And I'd like him to talk a little bit more about the kinds of concrete ways that states can integrate human rights in the rulebook.
Thank you, Ben. It is my real pleasure to be with you today. Thank you also to the Geneva Pledge members for their invitation. Human Rights Watch is an international human rights organization that works over in 90 countries. It conducts human rights fact-finding and documents human rights abuses on the ground. It brings the voices of the affected communities to the public and to decision makers. It is work based on an international human rights framework. And two examples I would like to mention stand out in connection with climate. These reports are available online. We produced a report on child marriage in Bangladesh, documenting how families living in flood-prone areas married off their daughters earlier than would have been the case because they were afraid to lose their houses. Another example is coming out of the Turkana region in northern Kenya, where the Turkana indigenous peoples living in flood-prone areas are also struggling with access to food, water, and healthcare that are aggravated by climate change. These examples and many others that have been documented around the world, as well as the conceptual linkages that were referred to earlier, lead to a situation where climate change and human rights linkages are better and better understood. For example, we now know that climate change is imposing an increasing burden on governments that are taking steps to protect vulnerable populations. This effort at protecting vulnerable populations is falling especially hard in countries with limited resources, and that would include, of course, developing countries. We also now know that effective action against climate change is indispensable to uphold the human rights of millions of people that stand to suffer as a result of loss of food and water, climate displacement, and aggravated conflict over natural resources. We also know that it is not just a question of human rights impacts resulting from climate, but also the issue of responses, appropriate responses that are respectful of human rights. There are promising developments against this background. Patricia Espinosa earlier today reminded us that for the first time the presidency held an event on human rights and climate change, focusing on the rights of the child. Stefan also on the panel reminded us that the Human Rights Council has adopted a number of climate change and human rights resolutions, the last of which speaks to the existential threat faced by some, particularly small island developing states. Adriana also reminded us that the Paris Agreement is the first multilateral instrument to explicitly reference human rights. And so we have human rights in the preamble. What does that mean for the rule book, the guidelines and modalities of implementation? And so this is getting to your question, Ben. First of all, as a matter of concept, the challenge of integration, that the climate crisis cannot be solved in isolation, but requires an integrative, holistic approach under the framework of sustainable development. Some voices have said that the ad hoc working group on the Paris Agreement is unable to incorporate human rights into the guidelines and modalities under negotiation. Well, I'm here to suggest that the opposite is actually the case by looking at specifics, the specifics of, for example, the agenda on the compliance mechanism. I started with this because accountability is a central human rights principle, and the compliance mechanism of the Paris Agreement is intended to secure observance with the legal obligations that parties have assumed under the agreement. These obligations are not many, in fact, they're very few, but they're very important. The obligation, for example, to submit a nationally determined contribution. Some in these negotiations are advocating for only having a self-party trigger. So the mechanism would come into operation only if the party in question raises a question of implementation. So that is a form of killing this mechanism. In order for accountability to be real, for a human rights approach to be incorporated into the rule book on this agenda item, this mechanism needs to be used and deliver results. And for that reason, others are proposing a civil society trigger where the public would be engaged in the monitoring of the implementation of this agreement, the Paris Agreement, and would be able to raise questions of compliance that would then be investigated. That's one specific example. Another specific example lies with nationally determined contribution. Much has been said about the process. There are good practices where countries are adopting participatory processes for the elaboration of nationally determined contributions. At the same time, it is possible to include in these documents, in these contributions, references to human rights. But they should not just be lip service references. They should include information that reflects the integration between human rights and climate. A third specific example, and the last one for the sake of time that I'll raise, is in relation to adaptation communications. The Paris Agreement contains very useful language guiding the content of these communications. They should reflect the need for a gender-responsive approach, participatory, fully transparent, focusing on the rights of marginalized groups and individuals. That sounds rather abstract. Perhaps an example could illustrate how this could work in practice. Human Rights Watch has conducted research very recently, its ongoing work on Zika, the disease that, like other born vector diseases, can increase and turn into an epidemic with high temperatures. We found that poor women are disproportionately hit by this disease, and this is because the taking care of babies that are born with microencephaly falls harder on poor women, and it is also because poor women are more likely to be the taking care of water sources in communities that lack access to water and sanitation. Having disaggregated data that is able to assess these impacts, having information on how the government is responding focusedly on these impacts is therefore key to having effective responses on the ground. That is where adaptation communications incorporating human rights can really make a difference. There is much more that could be said on the specifics of the acronym, the APA, the rule book, and how could it incorporate human rights. There's a side event that's following immediately this one that is hosted by the Center for International Environmental Law and Human Rights Watch. It's in the same room. So I will simply conclude by pointing out that there are ways for the APA negotiations on modalities and guidelines to incorporate human rights. And at the same time, the discussion of how to implement the human rights language in the Paris Agreement's preamble is not exhausted by those negotiations. The CMA can and should take this agenda forward. The same could be said for COP23, to engage climate justice, the human face of climate change, the human rights dimensions of this problem as an existential threat to many, as has been remarked by the Human Rights Council, especially to the inhabitants of small island developing states. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus, for those ideas and some concrete examples of how to take the commitment that all states have made to respect, promote, and consider human rights when taking climate action and operationalize them in the context of implementation of the Paris Agreement. And also for raising the work that the Human Rights Council has done and mandated in this area. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recently completed a study on climate change and its impacts on the rights of the child, which was mandated by the Human Rights Council and delved particularly into these kinds of issues. What are the human rights obligations that states have with regard to climate change, and what types of actions should they be taken to address those? And I'd encourage you all to look at that report. It's AHRC 3223, and I've got a summary of that here with me. We only have a few minutes for a few very quick questions, and then I will want to turn over the floor to our honored guest, Ambassador Khan, for her concluding remarks. So if anybody would like to ask a question of our panelists, please very brief, and I would ask the panelists as well to be brief in their response. I have a box I can throw at you if that makes it more enticing.
Thank you very much indeed. That's very convenient, isn't it? I am Thierry from a French trade union in France. I mean, trade unionists are very sensitive with human rights as a whole. And in a period where we know pretty well that some of the trade unionists are jailed on a daily basis because of their activity, would you say that working for the implementation of the Paris Agreement will help for more respect of human rights, and especially of trade unionists? I mean, not only trade unionists, but others, all the people who raise their voice in the various countries in order to implement the provision of the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
If we have another question, I think we'll take 2 or 3, and that's going to unfortunately be all the time for questions. So anybody else? Oh, this is getting more interesting. Oh.
Lindsay Cook, Quaker United Nations Office. Quick question. What do you, in your experience, see as some of the major pushbacks from some states on integrating human rights, and how can we help build confidence in those states to bring it in? Thank you.
Time for one more question. guess, back there or no? Okay. I think with that, I'll turn things over briefly to our panel. Okay, we do have one more question. We're just throwing the ball. Well, that's fun too. I think we should have started with throwing the microphone because that seems to have gotten everybody's attention. I'd like to turn to the unions. And the second about the potential role of issue.
Yeah, very quickly in response to both trade unions and more broadly human rights defenders and the shrinking space all over the world. I think the SDGs and the Paris Agreement and that whole issue provides an opportunity for human rights defenders to get on the front foot because there's no doubt that member states within the UN have seen that this is where the political and the financial and the resources traction has to be, making the SDGs work. And therefore, it is an opportunity that in that space, human rights defenders, including trade union representatives, can play that role and expand the space in which there can be participation, accountability, etc. So I think it's an opportunity. And similarly with the UN office, how can we persuade reluctant states to step up? I think we look around the world and we see increased populism, demagogy, vulnerability of governments to being swept away by public disillusionment with the system and with the lack of action of addressing their real problems. So this is an opportunity for member states to reconnect with their populations and reaffirm their legitimacy in the eyes of the public. And therefore, again, it's an opportunity both for civil society and human rights defenders and of states to see that this is a time for reclaiming and reaffirming the commitments that they've been making and therefore getting on the front foot in order to bring about the change that everyone has agreed is the call of these times.
As an activist working at the policy level and then working also with people in the grassroots, I see there's a lot of gaps within the policy and the implementation. That's a lot of problems related to the implementation. Also, the wording of the policy was strong and good, but that's the problems that we are facing. So I think here it's what needed is actually a guidance from the COP, from the UNCCC on how to have the step to respect human rights and to integrate human rights in the climate actions at the national level. I think it's very important to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Marcus, would you like to make some comments?
Well, only very briefly, thank you. On the first question, the integration of human rights in climate policy, one of the things it does, it brings together several critical constituencies, and in that context, labor and trade unions has not been absent of the discussion, and so that's out there. This, as regards to the second question, it is certainly not only a must, as in an obligation, or not only a theoretical possibility. The integration of human rights in climate policy is being done. There is actual practice, and sharing of those potentially good practices, one would hope, is also a step forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the question about implementation and also in terms of the Paris rulebook is not such an easy one. I mean, right now we're working very much at the conceptual level. So when do you bring in particular aspects? I mean, this morning in the global stocktake discussion, we were talking about modalities. So non-state actors should be part of the input that's given. And then there was one country, it wasn't mine, specifying the actors that are referenced in the Paris Agreement in that particular paragraph that we've heard before on human rights, right to health, and so on. So it's not an easy question. When do we move to specific interests? And I guess you can help us in reminding us that they have to be in there, because we tend to stay at the conceptual level.
Just very briefly on the second issue, I do agree with one of the ways to try to, let's say, convince some reluctant states is to show examples in how in the terrain, in the reality, we are all countries already doing some human rights policies regarding to climate change. Also, I do believe it is, for me, very clear that our colleagues in Geneva have been working a little bit more in deep on these linkages. And I do believe negotiators here at UNFCCC, which will try to get together and reflect more on these issues, because this is a kind of new issue in this context, and for some negotiators, I believe the understanding of those linkages are not that clear yet. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just to say, normally there is no fear between the climate change and the human rights and indigenous people rights. Both are not opposite, both are complementary. So if we want to have a sustainable world, we want to fight against climate change, we have to include human rights, respect it, and in order to respect it, we have to put it in all our policies. And let us be confident. That's just the issues. We have to be confident, and we have to work all together as partners, and then the human rights will be best of all environmental protections. As indigenous peoples, we never divide the rights of human and the right of environment. So then if we have this concept in our mind, we get food from environment and we grow up because we get food. And this is complementary and we can really make it. Don't get stuck into the wording like human right and get afraid, but let us go in practice and that can really help. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Ndu, and many. We're very honored to be joined by Ambassador Khan. So here, from perspective to the conference of the parties to the UNFCCC, and I think my word order was incorrect.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. And may I say congratulations, you have a very, very full room, which shows how interested people are in this very important subject and how connected they are to this imperative. So well done to the organizers, the High Commissioner's Office, as well as the Geneva Pledge. So good afternoon to you all, and it's a real pleasure. Bula Vinaka, everyone. And I think, you know, as we come closer and closer to COP23, you should all get used to saying Bula Vinaka, because that's what people will say at you in Fiji, and you will not be expected to say anything except Bula. It gives me great pleasure to be here this afternoon to discuss this important issue of incorporating human rights in climate action. And although I'm here in my capacity as chief negotiator for COP23, for the incoming COP23 Fijian presidency, I am also Fiji's permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva, where we breathe and speak and live human rights. So, and of course, I also represent Fiji on the Human Rights Council. And I still, after all these years, still provide human rights training to judges in Fiji. So this is an issue which is very important to me personally, and I'm really pleased again to see so many people here today, particularly a rugby player, which is very important in Fiji, and a special invitation for you, please, to come to Fiji for pre-COP. Yes, you'll be very welcome. So I and Fiji, on behalf of Fiji, was also one of the first signatories to the Geneva Pledge. And I was very pleased on Monday to witness the Executive Secretary also signing up to this important initiative. And the Geneva Pledge is based on a recognition of the importance of developing mutually reinforcing climate change and human rights policies. So this is what the Geneva Pledge is all about. Our collective future is threatened by climate change. Left unchecked, rising global temperatures will eventually impact the lives of every single person on this planet. For us in the Pacific, and for other small island states, and for vulnerable countries, the threat is already too real. We live with the consequences of climate change every day. Sea levels rise, a so-called slow onset event, is already forcing us in Fiji to relocate villages and communities, and it threatens the very existence of some of our neighbors. And ever more extreme weather events are already causing unspeakable damage and loss of life. Those of you in the room who will have seen the news, Cyclone Donna struck Vanuatu and came very close to New Caledonia, and hundreds are now left needing immediate help. And as we speak, Cyclone Ella is currently threatening Fiji. And this is only a year after we were hit by Cyclone Winston, which was the strongest ever cyclone to make landfall in the Southern Hemisphere. So you can understand why we consider these negotiations are so urgent, and why it is that we will do everything in our power as COP president to push for a decisive and concrete action following the momentum which started in Paris. During this week alone, I had the pleasure of attending the technical briefing on the rights of the child, the opening of the gender workshop, a listening and learning session on opportunities for grassroots engagement in responding for climate change, and now this very important and valuable panel. The views and experience which are shared in these forums this week demonstrate the Geneva Pledge in action and the mutually reinforcing nature of climate change and human rights. In Fiji, we have a constitutional right to a clean environment. In fact, the Constitution says every person has the right to a clean and healthy environment, which includes the right to have the natural world protected for the benefit of present and future generations through legislative and other measures. It's quite an extraordinary provision and very, very progressive and very important for Fiji. We are very proud of this provision, and we believe it can serve as an example to other countries and other governments about how human rights, the environment, and climate change can be entrenched in the fundamental laws of nations which guide all subsequent legislation and policies. In fact, in my view, human rights need to be integrated in every aspect of our lives, including in climate action. And as an example, the Fijian government is integrating human rights in our relocation guidelines. And in fact, the person responsible for the relocation guidelines is in this gathering. So we as presidency are committed to observing that no decisions are taken at COP23 that infringe on human rights, as well as facilitating decisions that strengthen them. And I'm pleased to note that the intergovernmental UNFCCC process in 2017 offers several possibilities to integrate human rights in climate action. First, the design of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform, agreed in Paris to prepare recommendations for COP23 here in November. And secondly, the content of the first Gender Action Plan, which was discussed at a workshop here, to be agreed on for COP23. However, integrating human rights in climate change is the primary responsibility of governments at national level. All governments have the responsibility to do what they can to ensure that they take the necessary steps to operationalize these commitments. This includes conducting stakeholder consultations for climate planning and legislation in relation to NDCs, national adaptation plans and climate action to ensure and strengthen the participation of women, children, persons with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups. This includes a responsibility to educate and empower young people. The incoming presidency acknowledges that the work being undertaken to implement the Paris Agreement will be led by parties. However, we intend to ensure that there is an inclusive, respectful, and participatory approach to our role. And we will look for opportunities to promote coherence with other multilateral processes. I know that you've had a very productive session because fortunately I was able to hear most of it. And I look forward to hearing the full summary of this event. I'm also looking forward to the chance for our team to meet and to speak with as many of you as possible during your time here in Bonn. And of course, as I've said earlier, in addition to the special invitation to rugby players, we look forward to welcoming all of you to COP23 in November. Vinaka Vekelevu, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very powerful statement and for the commitment to integrating human rights and climate action, both here in discussions at UNFCCC and at the national level. I just want to give one last thanks to Fiji, Costa Rica, and Switzerland for joining us here on the panel, and to the Geneva Pledge for Human Rights and Climate Action for being a welcome partner in this endeavor, and to all of our panelists for sharing with us their expertise. I also wanted to ask if you have a sign-up sheet, if you can circulate it towards the front of the room. Really appreciate that. And if you have any questions about anything you've heard today or did not hear, because this mic goes in and out, then please feel free to contact me. Thank you.
I was going just to make something very general, but then Benjamin took it, so I had to say something on the national level
So then the format is coming from office daily calls. So the daily calls from 9 to 10. So that if during this week is not possible,
next week's schedule. I know that Alison Sarah has been meeting with the various constituencies. And so, and Ambassador Khan has been running, Ambassador Sarah is running those consultations, which is a bit the diary. So if you haven't already met with Ambassador Khan, we can do that as well.
Yeah, for this one, it's under the Unfccc system. It's already we have been informed, but for the